Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into one of the most consequential power shifts of the 20th century, the rise of Imperial Japan. But this isn't just a story about battles and borders. It's a story about ambition, economic pressure, crumbling empires, and a world teetering on the edge of chaos. So let's start by asking a simple question. How does a small island nation go from isolation to industrial superpower in just a few decades, and why did that transformation send shockwaves across all of Asia? To understand that, we need to rewind to the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s. Japan, once closed off from the world, rapidly embraced modernization. Factories sprang up, railroads were built, a Western-style military emerged, and with this industrial boom came a growing appetite for coal, iron, oil, and influence. But here's the catch. Japan lacked the natural resources to feed its machines and its ambitions. So, expansion wasn't just about pride. It became an economic necessity. Now fast forward to the years after World War I. While much of the West was licking its wounds, Japan saw an opportunity. Fueled by nationalism and pride in its modern military, the country began adopting a more aggressive foreign policy. Nationalism wasn't just a slogan. It was a tool, a force that united the population behind expansion, conquest, and empire. Meanwhile, China was falling apart. The Qing dynasty had collapsed, warlords were fighting for control, and Western imperial powers had carved up treaty ports like slices of a colonial pie. The result? A fractured landscape, perfect for exploitation. Japan didn't just see opportunity, it saw a power vacuum. Then came the final piece of the puzzle, the Great Depression of 1929. As the global economy crumbled, Japan was hit hard. Trade slowed, jobs vanished, and military hardliners stepped into the spotlight. They argued that only expansion, only control of foreign land and foreign resources, could secure Japan's future. And in that desperation, radicalism found fertile ground. This is the world we're entering, a rising military-industrial power in need of resources, surrounded by chaos, and driven by leaders convinced that war was the answer. The dominoes were set, and soon, they would begin to fall. Now that we've seen the forces driving Japan's rise, let's zoom in on a single night in 1931, a night that changed everything. Picture this, it's September 18th, and Japanese troops are stationed near a railway line outside Mukden, in northeastern China. Suddenly, there's an explosion. A stretch of rail is damaged, but it's more symbolic than strategic, barely enough to stop a train. And yet, this tiny blast sets off a massive military response. Why? Because it was never about the damage. It was about the story. The Japanese blamed Chinese dissidents for sabotaging the railway. But here's the twist, Japanese soldiers planted the explosives themselves. It was a setup, a theatrical, pretext for war kind of setup. The kind of thing where the lie is more important than the truth, because the lie gives you a reason to act. This stage sabotage gave the Kwantung Army, the Japanese military force in the region, the perfect excuse to launch a full invasion of Manchuria. And they didn't wait for Tokyo to say yes. They didn't ask for permission. They just moved. Quickly, decisively, illegally. That's important, because it shows just how powerful the military had become within Japan's system. The Kwantung Army acted autonomously, completely bypassing the civilian government. And Tokyo? They were caught off guard, but instead of punishing the army, they backed the conquest. Why? Because it was popular, because it was successful, and because, frankly, civilian control was already unraveling. Within months, Japan had conquered Manchuria and installed a puppet regime called Manchukuo. It looked like a country on a map, but it was nothing more than a puppet state, run by the Japanese military, designed to extract resources and assert dominance in northern China. So let's recap. One fake explosion, one rogue army, and suddenly, an entire region falls under Japanese control. That's not just strategy, that's theater. It's power politics dressed up as self-defense. And the world? It watched. Let's take a step back, because the Mukden incident wasn't just a fluke, it was a symptom of something deeper and more dangerous brewing inside Japan's political structure. The roots of the problem go back to Japan's 1889 constitution. On the surface, it looked like a modern system, complete with a parliament and a prime minister. But buried in the fine print was a fatal flaw. Military ministers didn't report to the parliament. They reported directly to the emperor. That meant they could act without civilian approval. They were part of the government, but also outside of it. Untouchable, unchecked, unaccountable. Think about that for a second. Imagine giving your military the power to do whatever it wants, and then removing all the brakes. That's not just a crack in the system. That's a highway to authoritarianism. So by the time the 1930s rolled around, Japan's military didn't just have autonomy. It had an agenda, a regional one. Generals and hardliners believed it was Japan's destiny, no, its duty, to dominate Asia. They wanted land, resources, and strategic depth, and they were willing to ignore, or outright defy, the civilian government to get it. And let's not forget the economic motive. Japan needed coal, iron, and farmland. And Manchuria? It had it all. To the military, that wasn't just conquest. It was survival. It was national security wrapped in economic necessity. But here's the paradox. The system that gave them the power to conquer also created chaos. A military operating independently from its own government. That's a recipe for escalation without restraint. It's centralized ambition paired with decentralized control. And in that mismatch, between who could act and who could stop them, lay the seeds of something far more dangerous than a border dispute. You'd think that a blatant act of aggression, like blowing up your own railway to justify invading a neighbor, would trigger an international outcry. And it did, sort of, but the real story isn't what was said. It's what wasn't done. Let's start with the League of Nations. This was supposed to be the world's peacekeeping body, the international referee. And when Japan took over Manchuria, the League did, in fact, condemn the move. They said it was illegal. They said it violated international law. Strong words. But here's the thing. No sanctions, no enforcement, no real consequences. It was all bark, no bite. Japan simply walked out of the League in protest, and that was that. The message was clear. You can invade a country, install a puppet regime, and if you call it self-defense, the world might just let you get away with it. Next up, the United States. The US wasn't part of the League, but it did issue the Stimson Doctrine. That's a fancy way of saying, hey, we're not recognizing any territorial changes made by force. It sounded noble, but again, no action, no pressure, no economic penalties. It was a statement without muscle. And so, what we're left with is this vacuum, this gaping hole where accountability should have been. A decentralized global system without the tools or the will to stop militarism in its tracks. And here's where it gets scary, because when institutions fail to enforce the rules, others start to notice. They start taking notes, and the stage gets set for even more dangerous moves in the years to come. So what happens when a nation gets rewarded for breaking the rules? Simple. It keeps breaking them, only bigger, bolder, and with fewer apologies. The Mukden incident wasn't just a one-off. It became a blueprint, a proof of concept. Japan had learned that the world wouldn't stop them, even when the lies were obvious and the aggression was clear. And with that knowledge in hand, they doubled down. After taking Manchuria, Japan didn't stop. They expanded their military operations deeper into China. By 1937, they launched a full-scale invasion, what we now call the Second Sino-Japanese War. Cities were bombed, civilians massacred. The infamous rape of Nanjing would become one of the darkest chapters in modern warfare. And at every step, Japan justified its actions with the same logic: order through strength, stability through conquest. And they weren't the only ones watching. Other authoritarian powers, Germany, Italy, saw how Japan had steamrolled over global opinion. No real consequences, no united front to stop them, just diplomatic protests and shrugged shoulders. The pattern was clear: if you moved fast enough and wrapped your aggression in the language of national interest, you could redraw the map. Fast forward to Pearl Harbor in 1941. The attack that finally pulled the United States into World War II didn't come out of nowhere. It was the end point of a process that began back in Mukden, a process of unchecked ambition, rewarded aggression, and a world too fractured to push back. So when we talk about World War II in the Pacific, we can't just start with Pearl Harbor. We have to start with the lie that went unpunished, the fake explosion that led to real war. Because in history, nothing ripples in isolation. Every crisis becomes a precedent, and Mukden was the match that lit the fuse. By now, you might be thinking, this whole Mukden story sounds a little too familiar. And you'd be right, because once you see how manufactured crises can justify power grabs, you start seeing that tactic all over the place. Let's jump ahead to the 21st century. Think about the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. The official story? Weapons of mass destruction. A dire threat. A need to act before it's too late. But the weapons were never found. The intelligence? Flawed at best, deliberately skewed at worst. And yet, the war happened. Just like Mukden, the justification was built on shaky ground. But once the wheels were in motion, no one could stop them. Or look at Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. The Kremlin claimed it was protecting ethnic Russians, defending democracy, but beneath that was a strategic move to secure influence and control. Again, power dressed up in moral language. Again, the world protested, but didn't act decisively. Even the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, used to justify deeper US involvement in Vietnam, followed a similar pattern. Confusion, exaggeration, and a convenient enemy. These aren't isolated events. They're echoes, templates, replays of a strategy that keeps working because the incentives stay the same. Manufactured crises allow governments to do what they already want to do, but with a stamp of legitimacy. It's the illusion of defense masking the reality of offense. And what makes it even more dangerous is how effective it is. Once fear is ignited, once the narrative takes hold, it becomes nearly impossible to challenge. Because now it's not about facts. It's about identity, survival, patriotism. And history shows that in that environment, truth becomes optional. Mukden wasn't just a moment. It was a manual, and we've been flipping through its pages ever since. So what do we take away from all this? From one small explosion on a railway line to a global war that engulfed continents. First, we learn that history doesn't just repeat, it instructs. The Mukden incident wasn't just a turning point for Japan. It was a turning point in how modern states justify power, how they manufacture legitimacy, how they weaponize narrative. It teaches us that when power becomes centralized, whether in a military, a government, or a small group of decision-makers, the temptation to bypass accountability grows stronger. There's less debate, fewer checks, and more space to act in the shadows. But Mukden also shows us something deeper, how fragile truth can be in the hands of those who control the story. One staged event was enough to justify invasion, occupation, and eventually, total war. Not because the story was true, but because it served a purpose. And that's where we, as individuals, as students of history, come in. Our job isn't just to memorize dates and battles. It's to recognize patterns, to challenge official stories, to ask who benefits, who decides, and what's being left out. Because if we don't preserve historical memory, if we don't question the convenient explanations, we risk falling for the same scripts over and over again. Different flags, different names, same tactics. Mukden matters because it reminds us that the greatest threat isn't always the enemy outside the gate. Sometimes, it's the unchecked power within. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more episodes of Truth Behind History. And if you want to keep the conversation going, check out the podcast version of this episode. Link is in the description. Explore the channel for more videos like this, where we unravel the stories behind the headlines and give history the depth it deserves.